Thank you, Julian. Good morning, everybody. When the TBA invited me to speak today on this subject, I was delighted to do so, as it's a subject very close to my heart. I'm sure I'm not alone in saying that, and I'm sure that applies to many other people in the room. I'm just going to spend a little bit of time setting out the current scene and take a brief canter through what the landscape looks like and what the data trends are telling us, and then I'll indicate the steps being taken as part of this long-term project to encourage greater strength in depth in stayers. So, why is the staying horse important? It's probably not necessary for me to ask that rhetorical question. I'd hazard a guess that everyone does actually recognise the value of these horses to horse racing and to breeding, clearly, and not only for flat racing, but also in terms of the impact on the pool of jump stallions too. It remains vital that Europe supports a strong programme for horses racing at the classic distance and beyond. We've recognised the threat of a gradual decline in the perceived value of the staying horse, which brings vitality and variety, as both Julian and Philip have touched on, to the racing programme and to pedigrees, and hence we embarked upon a focused study of needs and opportunities. I do appreciate that for obvious commercial reasons, no one really sets out to breed a horse that's going to excel over, say, 2 miles on the flat, and yet we do all love them. The sport loves them. And for the continued long-term health of the thoroughbred, we should be taking a collective responsibility, in my mind, towards protecting, encouraging, and nurturing bloodlines with stamina. I recognise that it is expensive to breed stayers. They tend to be less attractive at the yearling sales, and they are unfortunately harder to sell. We know that breeders and owners around the globe are noticeably more inclined to search for speed. We all understand the reasons for that, but there is an increasing number of people in this day and age who are searching for that quick return. Despite the fact that the Derby winning sires often, not always, but often, still dominate at the top end of the market, for which we're all eternally grateful, there is actually less demand for them overall. Another factor of which we'll all be aware is that the old-fashioned owner breeder who's always tried to breed that top-class middle distance horse is undoubtedly and very sadly diminishing in number. So the programme for the staying horse certainly features some historic and important races, but perhaps not entirely with it's not entirely cohesive throughout the year, and it's not well balanced enough for this work that we can do there. It's probably not ambitious enough to create a change in behaviour which is sufficient to safeguard the staying programme and the gene pool for the future. There appear to certainly be certain elements relating to the staying horse that are in steady decline, and it would not be a trend that one would want to see continue, as it will certainly be virtually impossible to reverse after any period of time. Very few, if any, other parts of the world provide a balanced series of races for such horses, and some, such as the USA, for instance, appear to have almost given up altogether, although I am incidentally involved in ongoing talks with America on that subject, which is fascinating to be involved in. It's of course been interesting to witness the growing appetite from Australia, which Philip's touched on, for a staying programme, albeit that they've been wholly reliant on acquiring European imported horses to service it. And this not insubstantial exodus of potential stayers to Australia has perhaps served to enhance our growing awareness of a need to develop the strength and depth of horses destined to excel over longer distances. So, in a bid to provide a more progressive programme for stayers, the overarching aim would be to encourage more breeders to patronise middle distance stallions, in the knowledge that there are actually better opportunities for their offspring to prove their worth, and in turn, hopefully making them more desirable to yearling buyers. We'd have an ambition, therefore, to start changing some trends in breeding or in the behaviour of owners, or perhaps bloodstock agents and sales companies as well. This naturally will not happen quickly. You've heard that a lot already this morning, and you'll probably continue to hear it. It may take many years, but we should certainly be striving to build a stronger foundation to the future, for the future of the staying horse. The downward trend, which Julian has touched on, has been steady but progressive over the last 20 years. And if that trend line were to continue on that same trajectory for the next 20 years, for instance, I think it's fair to say we'd all be in a fairly dark place. So let's have a brief look at what's been happening in recent history in terms of those trends and why, therefore, our attention should be focused on this type of horse. Firstly, I'd stress there's been no dramatic recent slump. But it is fair to say the trend lines have been slowly and steadily going one way. Effectively, we're looking to change perhaps the course of a slow-moving ocean liner, and that doesn't happen quickly, but we do need to arrest the decline. I promise not to kill you with statistics, I really do, so I'm going to keep this pretty top line. Throughout the data slides, distances are often categorized according to what we call, some of you will be familiar with this perhaps, the SMILE categories, which we've defined here on the slide, basically broken down into sprint, mile, 10 furlongs, 12 furlongs, and anything further than that. So looking briefly at the executive summary of the statistical package that we've put together, and we'll just see a brief illustration of each of these points in turn, so I'll skip over them. But these are the headlines, shall we say. The percentage of the race programme at long and extended trips, so that's basically 12 furlongs and beyond, has declined from 21.3% to 17.9% since 1996. That doesn't sound a lot in itself, but it is really quite a meaningful downturn. The annual race ratings of Group 1 and Group 2 races for stayers have fluctuated, but with a slight trend upwards, actually, so no major concern at the top end in terms of quality. We just don't have enough of them. Gradual decline in the percentage of horses being campaigned over long and extended distances since 96, although the actual number has increased, but clearly not as fast as shorter distances. Average field sizes consistently in decline across all categories, of which we're all aware. The majority of horses running in Britain are sired by stallions that never won beyond a mile. There's been a marked increase in horses running by stallions whose furthest winning distance was less than a mile. It's almost that statistic that I perhaps find more concerning than any other. The majority of horses running in Britain are sired by stallions that never won beyond a mile. Percentage of runners who are by stallions that won over 12 furlongs or beyond at least once has declined from 19% 20 years ago to 15% now. Again, that's quite a telling statistic to my mind. Also, the fact that the proportion of stallions that won over 12 furlongs or beyond at least once has declined from 28% to 23%. The average sales prices of the progeny of horses that won over 12 furlongs or beyond still does outstrip those that were campaigned at below a mile. There's probably no surprise to any of us, but the gap does look like it is closing. Now, this last point is not perhaps wholly relevant, but it's interesting all the same. Many of you will have noticed the relatively recent trend for the best Irish stayers being the progeny of speedier mares. I mean, effectively, it's Coolmore taking the decision to send speedier mares to Galileo in the main, but whereas in Britain we do tend to approach it the other way round, and there's just a slide to illustrate that interesting point. So looking at here, this slide, it basically just represents the volume of races broken down by distance over the last 20 years. The bar graphs there, and this will be represented through the rest of the slides in the main. Colour at the top represents sprint races and then mile races, 10 furlong races, 12 furlong races, and then staying races, the smallest colour at the bottom, as you would expect. And I mean, although the number of stayers races, as I've touched on, numerically over the last 20 years has actually increased, it's the percentage of the programme that they make up that's the interesting point. And probably the easiest way to view that is just that table at the bottom there, which talks about the percentage of the programme they make up. So basically, sprint, mile has increased percentage over the last 20 years. 10 furlongs has stayed the same. 12 furlongs and extended distances has reduced. Quick slide there just to indicate the average annual race ratings of group races, staying group races, Group 1 and Group 2. You can see that they've fluctuated, but not a huge amount. They've actually been fairly consistent over the last 20 years, and not a huge problem for us to be concerned about in terms of the quality of the best horses that we're able to produce to excel over staying distances. Interestingly, the British Champions Day Long Distance Cup, which is still a Group 2 race at this stage, but we hope to change that in the future, was the highest rated staying group race last year. Moving on, horse population, number of horses whose furthest run came at 12 furlongs or more by year. I think the interesting thing to look at here really is that blue line at the top, which just indicates what I touched on earlier, that overall trend line going one way. And as I said, if you continued that trajectory going forward, it really would start to be a major concern to us. So the percentage of runners whose furthest run came over 13 furlongs or more, 16.4% of the population in 96, dropped down to 13.1% last year. Average field size, as I indicated before, it's been dropping for everything for a period of time now. We all understand the reasons why: more fixtures, more races, and all the commercial and funding reasons why that's been important. We are arresting that decline, have been doing so in recent years, and have set out to do so again. You're probably all very much aware of that. I think it's probably fair to say that all this slide really shows is that the race programme does generally match the available horse population, and it's been consistent in doing so throughout this century, really. What we want to do with a project like this, though, is start to nudge the scales so that we're actually putting on slightly more races for this type of horse than statistically we should. And we need to do this responsibly, and we can't afford to push the scales too far too soon. We can't afford to start creating too many uncompetitive races, small field events, because we will lose support for this project quite quickly if we do that. But we do want to make it more attractive to breed, own, train, buy a staying horse, and so we need to be a little bit brave in some areas. This slide looks at the sire's maximum winning distance, the proportion of runners made up by the sire's maximum winning distance. We've clubbed 12 furlongs plus together there for obvious reasons. It would be a very small sample size if we were just looking at sires who had effectively were just staying horses. We obviously don't have too many of them siring flat horses, but it's quite easy to see there that line, that coloured line at the top, the sort of dark coloured line at the top, which represents the number of runners by stallions who won over distances below a mile, and that's quite clearly going one way. This slide looks at the number of stallions with GB runners by maximum winning distance. So again, I touched on this earlier, but marked decline in the proportion of runners that are by stallions that won over long distances. Probably looking at that table on the right indicates that in the easiest way. to understand. So 12 furlongs plus reduced from 28% in 96 down to 23% last year. Average sales price of flat horses by maximum winning distance. So probably the easiest thing to look at here is the trend lines, the dotted trend lines. So the one at the top there indicates 12 furlong plus, still obviously outstripping stallions who excelled at lesser distances, but you can, I think it's probably fair to say you can see that that gap is closing. Distance at which the dams of our best stayers, so the stayers in the world rankings, the distance at which the dam achieved her best rating. We thought this would be quite interesting to look at, and it does, you know, as I said earlier, it effectively just represents the increasing trend from Coolmore to send speedier types to Galileo. But I think it's quite an interesting graph. I'm effectively Britain in blue, Ireland in green, and you can see that there's been a shift in behaviour, and we've effectively flip-flopped. We approach it from a completely opposite angle, and it'll be interesting over a period of time now to see perhaps which is the more successful. So, moving on to the steps being taken to arrest this slow decline. How are we going to go about this? The BHA undertook a consultation process during last summer. Some of you in the room were involved in that, which saw us gather views from a cross-section: breeders, owners, trainers, racing managers, racecourses, bloodstock agents, sales company, and the media. And we did extend that to some obvious overseas individuals. The questions focused on how best to future-proof the development of the staying horse. The responses that were received, many of which did actually follow consistent themes, which is always very helpful. They in general proved very helpful in terms of what options are likely to prove the most successful incentives for people to perhaps change their behaviour, change their attitude, change their perception with regard to breeding, owning, buying, or training a horse that is likely to have a propensity to excel over longer distances. This has therefore proved helpful to deliver effectively a roadmap towards providing a future environment which will hopefully over time achieve the overarching aims of the project. It's clear, as mentioned earlier, that an increasing number of high-quality future stayers are being lost to export to Australia, given the growing programme there and the lure of the Melbourne Cup. And it's therefore seen as important that, as well as encouraging a gradual change of approach in terms of breeding and ownership behaviour, but that the pattern programme should be noticeably enhanced. And this certainly came through loud and clear in that consultation process. And within that we should strive to achieve some significant prize money increases to go along with any changes in pattern status. I appreciate that the status of a pattern race itself will not be that relevant to a gelding, for instance, but it will be enhanced prize money that will make owners think twice about selling their horses for export. So some high-profile enhancements within the pattern were required, alongside a collection of changes within the rest of the programme, particularly at the developmental stage of a horse's career, and we'll return to that aspect shortly. So I constructed a strong case to put before the European Patent Committee, and over a number of meetings managed to successfully secure their full support for the project. It was agreed that a subcommittee of the EPC should be set up, made up of Britain, France and Ireland, to consider the subject in more detail and to come up with a proposal for a collection of sensible enhancements which would help to make the Stayers black type programme more attractive. But before we focused on the specifics of upgrading or adding any new black type races, what I needed to do was to get the EPC to agree to some overarching principles. A fundamental component of this project was trying to safeguard and encourage the future of the staying horse, it's not only about enhancing the programme for them, therefore, but we needed to ensure that we protected the existing races. For instance, there were a number of our staying races in Europe which, under the European Patent Committee ground rules, were on the warning list and therefore at risk of being downgraded, effectively because there isn't sufficient strength and depth to achieve the required race rating on a consistent basis. So there was little point in trying to enhance the stayers programme on the one hand, whilst at the same time see other sections of the black type programme for stayers being downgraded and diminished. So as such, I sought support from the EPC subcommittee to agree to the following. The no pattern race in Europe over 13 furlongs or further will be downgraded before 2022. So we've effectively got a 5-year moratorium on downgrades with a position to be reviewed thereafter. Any exceptional upgrades, and I'll come back to that phrase in a minute, to be introduced this year or thereafter should also have their status protected for the same period. So it's natural to think that if we upgrade a race, a staying race, it will take some time to prove its worth. And there's little point in upgrading it 1 year and effectively under the EPC ground rules seeing it downgraded 1 or 2 years later. We need to give these races time. And finally, it was agreed by the EPC that yes, we should seek to build an improved overall black type programme for the stayer, which should provide Europe's best chance of creating a meaningful incentive behavioural change. So a weighty success, effectively, to achieve their support on that. You may recall the major alterations that we introduced to the 3-year-old, you will recall, 3-year-old sprint programme last year, 2015. The unprecedented creation of the Group 1 Commonwealth Cup at the Royal Meeting. But with that particular project, the horses, quite different to this one, the horses were actually in existence. They were just not catered for properly in order to allow horses to excel and develop to the best of their ability. Whereas in the staying category, we're looking at a different scenario altogether, really. We need to encourage the production and retention from export of more quality middle distance stroke staying horses. However, as with the considerable improvements to the pattern programme that we undertook for mares, older fillies and mares, about 10 years ago, or with the 3-year-old sprint changes last year, this exercise would need to include the upgrade of races outside of the EPC ground rules, which we term, so that term I used earlier, exceptional upgrades. So they're not races that could legitimately be upgraded within the rules. And in order to do that, I can only effectively do it if I get the unanimous support of the EPC member countries, and it needs to be part of a wide-scale strategic project. It's worth noting on that point, I think, that there were more obvious commercial reasons why the previous 2 EPC projects, aimed at older fillies and mares, and more recently the sprint programme, would work. I think the former, it's fair to say, the fillies one offered more valuable, offered a greater number and increased in value black type opportunities, which would help to persuade people to keep a quality filly in training beyond her 3-year-old year and perhaps not send her to America, which was happening to an increasing degree. And the project delivered immediate success, whilst the latter project with the 3-year-old sprinters provided opportunities for them to be competitive in their field in the first half of the season, which they really weren't being, but with the additional prospect of creating stallions. And you're all aware that seems to, as a project, seems to have taken off very quickly indeed as well. By contrast, I recognise that it will be more difficult to produce commercial success or easily change behaviour in the staying race area, and therefore we need a multi-pronged approach to this, and we need time. So moving on to that second bullet point there, it was also proposed that we should consider setting high prize money values for any newly upgraded Group 1 race in Europe, which we achieved with the Goodwood Cup, which was is to be run at £500,000. And the subcommittee felt the programme could be improved significantly by a relatively small number of meaningful changes. The aim should be to try to provide an aspirational and well-balanced staying black tyke programme for 3-year-olds, for fillies and for the older horses. So what enhancements did we successfully achieve with the EPC for this year? I will just run over these very quickly because they're obviously all they've been well publicised and they're in the public domain. The pennant there, obviously the Goodwood Cup had been a long-held ambition of mine, certainly to achieve another Group 1 Cup race in Britain. And in addition to that was the successful upgrade of the listed Queen's Vase at the Royal Meeting, not just up to Group 3 from listed, but catapulted straight up to Group 2 for this year. A few years ago, the EPC had downgraded the Queen's Vase at Royal Ascot. It was a really disappointing outcome that happened, but I think it's probably fair to say it may not have been a bad thing at the time because it did in fact help to concentrate a number of people's minds on the need to develop greater depth to that pool of young stayers. Queen's Vase is clearly the key 3-year-old staying race in the first half of the season, and there's good reason to make it a proper target. And having the race as a Group 2 hopefully will make a noticeable difference over time, and also the reduction to 14 furlongs, which may to some people seem slightly perverse, but it's something that a significant majority of those canvassed supported. The previous trip of 2 miles for a 3-year-old in mid-June, it's a very stiff test, whereas the slightly reduced distance should hopefully see the race appeal to a wider pool of young horses with potential to be high-class stayers of the future. Just the third race on that list there, the Oleander Rennen at Hopper Garden, which was run earlier in May, which we upgraded to Group 2. It's just worth a mention, basically, because it was a very successful race and they were extremely pleased with it, and it certainly achieved a fair amount of publicity for them. EPC subcommittee is going to continue to meet throughout this year. We've met twice already, due to meet again fairly shortly. And we're very hopeful that we'll be able to put together a proposal to go to the main EPC committee and achieve some further success next year for improvements to the black type programme, particularly for fillies and for 3-year-olds, to just give them a more coherent programme throughout Europe. What else have we been doing? So moving on from the pattern, again, I'll just run through these fairly quickly, but what changes have we made to the race programme so far? Running through chronologically, we started in 2015 by asking racecourses to apply to us for the opportunity to stage 2 valuable 3-year-old only 14 furlong handicaps. They've been in existence, £50,000 each, due to go up in value. One at Haydock in September, one at York in October. We reintroduced the listed Zetland Stakes for 2-year-olds over 10 furlongs at Newmarket in October. Then last year, we asked racecourses to apply for the opportunity to stage a new fillies listed race over 14 furlongs in the autumn. Beckford Stakes at Bath, good running of that last year. Hopefully that will continue to grow. We converted the Silver Cup handicap at York in July, 14 furlong race, to a weight for age listed contest, and that had the best race rating last year it's ever had by some considerable way. I'm actually hoping to get that up to Group 3 in the future. And we created 4 new Class 2 staying handicaps for fillies, 1 a month through the summer. The one in June is actually a 3-year-old only race, and a number of those I think are supported by the TBA. We also introduced some sire restricted maiden races for 2-year-olds, sponsored by the EBF, and they're effectively races for the progeny of sires who won over at least 10 furlongs. Some of them worked very well, some of them less so, but they're a prime example of the kind of races that we need to give some time to. We also created a new staying 3-year-old conditioned stakes at Newbury in October. Moving on to this year, Goodwood Cup and Queen's Vase. I've touched on the March Stakes at Goodwood, which is a listed race. The August Bank Holiday meeting used to be a 3-year-old only race. We changed it to become an older horse race on the back of it achieving small fields for a number of years, but we've bitten the bullet and reverted to a 3-year-old only race because it's part of the programme to improve the stayers fare for 3-year-olds only. And we've also expanded the number of sire-restricted maiden and novice races, and we've done a fairly brave thing with a number of them by restricting them to sires who have actually won over 12 furlongs or further. Not expecting them to have huge fields in the first instance, but hopefully it's something that we can improve going forward. We're also going to increase in the autumn the number of 2-year-old races over longer distances, effectively 9 and 10 furlongs. We've introduced a 10-furlong condition stakes for 2-year-olds about a month after the Zetland Stakes, which will hopefully give those horses something else to aim at. 4 new valuable staying handicaps for 3-year-olds, each with a prize fund of at least £50,000, which is supported by the BHA, and with an expectation for them to be run for at least £100,000 next year. And we're seeing an expansion in the programme of maiden races for 3-year-olds over 12 furlongs as well. So that's 2017. What next? What else do we have in mind? More of the same, for sure. Further enhancements, therefore, for the black type programme for 2018. We're going to continue with the gradual improvement of the stayers programme certainly for the next 3 years. Discussions, this is an important one for everybody, I'm sure, but discussions are taking place about how we might enhance a process of a process of redirecting additional funds to certain sections of the stayers programme. There'll be some evidence of that next year, and I'm hopeful more to come, more tangible progress to come in 2019. And amongst the proposals of investing some of the additional levy money for 2018 is the intention to boost the plus 10 bonus scheme next year, which Julian mentioned earlier, with around £300,000 of revenue being invested to support returns to the 3-year-old staying horse, thereby aligning the plus 10 scheme with the broader objective of this project of encouraging the breeding and racing of stayers. The detail of that hasn't actually been announced yet. It's imminent, and there are certainly people in the room who know a lot more about it than I do. I might at this point just ask you to stand up, Larry Allen, in case anybody is unaware of who Larry is. Larry works for the BHA and is the expert on plus 10, so if anybody wants to talk about plus 10 in the break, please approach her. And then the last bullet point there, which Philip has mentioned, I mean, it's fair to say we're probably only really just at the starting gate on, but we think it's important, really important, to find effective means to encourage the production of more quality stayers. When I say that, I'm not talking about an increase in the volume of slow horses. Quality stayers are absolutely not slow. We want to find a way of incentivising people to patronise middle distance stallions to a greater degree, therefore, and the TBA will be exploring ideas on how to drive that behaviour, how best to achieve that, and I'm looking forward to helping out with that. There are any number of options, no doubt, in terms of the best way to do this, and we'll try to find the most effective means and then a pragmatic way of funding it, and we're certainly very keen to hear people's views on what those options might actually look like. So in summary, it's important for all of us to view this as a long-term project in terms of delivering tangible results, certainly, but it's also a project of international importance. It'll take years and perhaps some major cost to achieve what is needed, and many people, it's probably fair to say, who will not presently be thinking that there's anything in it for them. And it will perhaps need a fair amount of persuasion in terms of getting their support. So accordingly, we need to emphasise that the aims of the exercise are far-reaching, including maintaining the variety in the gene pool and, as a consequence, the programme, doing so in the expectation that the fact successful stayers need to be sufficiently durable to race for several seasons makes their genes a crucial element in that pool. As a result of an increased number of quality horses having an extended career in one section of the programme, flat racing should be able to obtain some added advantages which accrue from the continuity provided by prolonged rivalry across several generations, hugely valuable to the sport. Not only would the flat benefit from a successful enhancement to the programme along the lines of the output from that consultation process I mentioned, but a failure to stop a slow shift towards the position in the US gene pool would be truly disastrous, not just for flat racing, but for jumping too. Clearly there is a weighty responsibility, therefore, to protect the future continued production of quality stayers for a number of wide-ranging, significant reasons. So the rich diversity of our race programme, we've touched on, myself, Julian, Philip, very important message, maintaining variety in the gene pool, you'll all appreciate, and as a consequence, the horse population, all of which certainly creates one of the most important and enviable, fascinating dimensions of British and European racing. So I reiterate, aim of the project is to introduce a number of changes, short term, next 3 to 5 years, probably longer, if I'm honest, in order to try and change that trend line that you saw earlier and safeguard the future of the stayer for future generations, for which I believe we do all have that collective responsibility. And it will take patience, it will take commitment, and it will certainly take a fair degree of determination. Thank you.